They say blood is thicker than water, but no one warns you what happens when that blood turns cold. When your own child looks at you like you're a stain on their perfect life. When love becomes shame, and shame becomes a prison with concrete walls and no windows. This is the story of how my son tried to bury me alive in our own basement, and how I crawled out with enough dirt on him to bury his entire future. My name is Margaret Walsh, and for 63 years I believed family meant everything. I was wrong. Family can mean nothing when pride gets in the way. But secrets. Secrets mean everything when you're fighting for your life. It started with the accident, not mine, his. The one that changed everything and made him see me as a liability instead of his mother. The one he thought I'd never remember, even though I remembered every single detail, every lie, every cover-up, every dollar that disappeared. And when he locked me away to protect his reputation, he had no idea he was locking himself in with the very person who could destroy him. This is how a mother's love became a son's worst nightmare. The day everything changed wasn't marked by thunder or lightning. It was a Tuesday morning in October, ordinary as oatmeal, with leaves falling like secrets outside my kitchen window. I was washing dishes from breakfast when I heard the crash. Not the crash that would haunt us both for years to come. This was just a glass hitting the floor, nothing more. But when I bent down to clean it up, the room spun like a carnival ride, and I went down hard. My hip struck the cabinet corner, my head bounced off the linoleum, and for a moment the world went black. When I came to, David was kneeling beside me, his face white as paper. His hands shook as he helped me sit up, and I could smell coffee on his breath mixed with something else. Something medicinal and sharp. Mom, Jesus, I thought. He stopped himself, but I heard the rest in his eyes. He thought I was dead. For a split second, I saw relief flicker across his face before guilt replaced it. I'm fine, I said, though my hips screamed otherwise. Just got dizzy, but I wasn't fine. The dizziness came back the next day, and the day after that. My balance, once steady as a rock, became unreliable. I started holding on to walls, taking my time on the stairs. Small things at first, manageable things. David noticed everything. He started hovering, watching me with the intensity of a hawk circling prey. At first I thought it was concern. Maternal instinct dies hard, even when it should. I told myself he was being a good son, finally stepping up after years of polite distance, since his father's death. I should have known better. I should have recognized the calculating look in his eyes, the way he measured my weakness like a contractor measuring for renovation. But mothers see what they want to see, especially mothers who spent 30 years raising a boy alone after his father walked out, who sacrificed everything to put him through law school, who believed love could conquer the growing coldness between them. The first time he suggested I move to the basement, I laughed. The basement? David, I'm not an old couch you're storing. He had the grace to look embarrassed. It's not like that, Mom. It's just practical. The bedroom down there is bigger. Safer. No stairs to worry about. I can manage the stairs just fine. Can you? He pulled out his phone, showed me a video I didn't remember him taking. Me gripping the banister with both hands, taking each step like I was walking on ice. This was yesterday, Mom. You were holding on so tight your knuckles were white. The video was damning, but something about it felt wrong. The timestamp showed 3 a.m., but I didn't remember being up at 3 in the morning. I didn't remember going upstairs at all. When did you take this? Does it matter? The point is, you're not safe up there anymore. But it did matter. It mattered, because I was starting to have gaps in my memory, moments that slipped away like water through me fingers, and David was always there, watching, recording, documenting my decline with the thoroughness of someone building a case. The basement room was nice enough. David had clearly put effort into it. New carpet, fresh paint, a small kitchenette in the corner, even a television mounted on the wall, but no windows. Not a single window to the outside world. It's temporary, he assured me as we moved my things downstairs. Just until we figure out what's causing the dizzy spells. Temporary, that word would echo in my head for months. The first week wasn't so bad. David brought me meals, checked on me regularly, even sat and watched television with me in the evenings. He was attentive in a way he hadn't been since childhood, and despite the strange circumstances, part of me was grateful for the attention. But then his friends started coming over. I heard them first, voices upstairs, laughter, the clink of glasses. David was entertaining again, something he'd rarely done since I moved in with him after selling my house. I started toward the stairs to say hello, maybe offer to make some appetizers. I'd always been good with David's friends, back when he brought them around. That's when I discovered the lock. A heavy deadbolt, installed from the outside. New hardware that gleamed in the basement's fluorescent light. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. I knocked, gently at first, then harder. David, David, the door is locked. Footsteps approached, but the door didn't open. Instead his voice came through the wood, muffled but clear. I know, Mom, it's for your safety. You've been sleepwalking, remember, Doctor? Hendricks said confusion can cause wandering. Sleepwalking, Doctor. Hendricks? I didn't remember any doctor, didn't remember sleepwalking. But then again I didn't remember a lot of things lately. The gaps in my memory were growing wider, swallowing entire days sometimes. I want to come upstairs. Not tonight, Mom. You need to rest. I'll check on you in the morning. The voices upstairs grew louder, more animated. I pressed my ear to the door and caught fragments of conversation. Something about a case David was working on, something about money, big money, and then I heard something that made my blood freeze. The old lady won't be a problem much longer. Few more months and she'll be completely gone. I jerked back from the door like it had burned me. The old lady. He was talking about me like I was already dead, already buried, like I was just an inconvenience waiting to be disposed of. That night I sat on the edge of my basement bed and forced myself to think. Really think past the fog that seemed to cloud my mind more each day. I tried to remember the last time I'd spoken to anyone besides David. Tried to remember the last time I'd left the house, made a phone call, had a conversation with a neighbor. The memories were there but they felt distant, like looking at photographs through dirty glass. Mrs. Patterson next door, who used to bring me tomatoes from her garden. My sister Ellen in Phoenix, who called every Sunday. My old friend Rose from church who invited me to lunch every month. When was the last time any of them had called? When was the last time I'd answered the phone at all? I looked around the basement room with new eyes. Nice carpet, yes. Fresh paint, certainly, but also no phone, no computer, no way to contact the outside world except through David. A prison doesn't have to have bars to be a prison. That's when I started paying attention. Really paying attention. To the patterns, the routines, the things that didn't add up. David's morning visits with a cup of coffee that tasted slightly off, his insistence that I take my vitamins, pills I didn't remember any doctor prescribing. The way he watched me swallow them, waiting until I opened my mouth to show they were gone. The way my memory got foggier on the days I took the most pills. The way he smiled when I couldn't remember things, like my confusion was a gift he'd been waiting for. I started palming the pills, hiding them under my tongue, spitting them out when he left. And slowly, very slowly, the fog began to lift. Memory is a funny thing. When it's compromised, you don't realize how much you've lost until it starts coming back. Like walking out of a dark room into sunlight. At first everything is too bright, too sharp, too overwhelming. But then your eyes adjust, and you see clearly for the first time in months. The first clear memory that returned was of David's late-night phone calls. I'd been lying in bed, somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, when his voice drifted down from upstairs. The basement's acoustics were strange. Certain sounds carried perfectly while others were muffled. His voice was one of the ones that carried. Don't care what it takes. The Peterson case is worth $12 million, and I'm not losing it because some old woman remembers the wrong thing. Peterson case. The name tickled something in the back of my mind, but I couldn't quite grasp it. Not yet. The phone calls became a nightly ritual I looked forward to in a twisted way. Each conversation revealed a little more about David's life, the life he'd been hiding from me even before the basement. Late-night discussions with people whose names I didn't recognize about cases that seemed to involve enormous sums of money. References to evidence that needed to disappear, witnesses who needed to stay quiet, judges who could be influenced. My son, the lawyer I'd been so proud of, was dirty. But dirty how? And why did it matter what some old woman remembered? I started exercising my memory like a muscle, fighting against whatever those pills had been doing to me. I made lists of everything I could remember, writing them on napkins with a pen I'd found in the kitchenette drawer. Names, dates, conversations, events from the past few years that had seemed unimportant at the time but might be significant now. The Peterson name kept surfacing in my memories, attached to fragments of conversations, newspaper headlines I'd glimpsed, something David had mentioned in passing months ago. But the harder I tried to remember, the more elusive it became. Then David made a mistake. He brought me a newspaper one morning, folded to the crossword puzzle. A small kindness that I accepted gratefully, though I noticed he'd torn out several pages first. I worked the puzzle slowly, letting my mind wander, when I spotted a headline on the back of the page he'd missed. Peterson family settles wrongful death suit for undisclosed amount. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I was standing in David's kitchen 6 months ago, before the dizziness started, before the basement. He was on the phone, pacing like he did when he was agitated. I'd come upstairs for a glass of water and caught the tail end of his conversation. Peterson kid was drunk off his ass. 3 witnesses saw him run the red light. But the family's got money, and they're not going to let their golden boy go down for vehicular manslaughter. I'd asked him about it later, casual-like. David had always been secretive about his cases, but he'd seemed unusually tense about this one. Just a traffic accident, Mom. Nothing to worry about. But it wasn't just a traffic accident. The family had lost someone, a mother, based on what I could piece together from the limited article. And David was representing the drunk driver who killed her. That should have been the end of it. Lawyers represent guilty people all the time. That's how the system works. But something nagged at me, some detail I was missing. I spent the next 3 days in what I privately called memory archaeology, digging through layers of suppressed recollections. The pills had done their work well, but they hadn't erased everything. Just made it harder to access, like files buried deep in a computer's hard drive. And then I remembered the blood. It was the night after David's phone conversation about the Peterson case. I'd gotten up around midnight to use the bathroom when I noticed light coming from under David's office door. I'd padded over in my slippers, planning to tell him he should get some sleep, when I heard him talking to someone. But this time he wasn't on the phone. Through a crack in the door I could see David sitting across from a young man I didn't recognize. Early 20s, blonde hair, expensive clothes that couldn't hide how scared he looked. His hands were shaking as he lifted a coffee cup to his lips. "Can't stop thinking about it," the young man was saying. "I keep seeing her face right before. God. David. There was so much blood. Listen to me carefully, Marcus." David's voice was calm, professional. "You were never there. You were at the country club with friends. I've already spoken to them. They'll back up your alibi. The car was stolen that night, remember? You reported it stolen the next morning. But what about the damage? The front bumper, the headlight. Already taken care of. Your father's mechanic will swear the car was brought in with that damage already there. Just some punk kids joyriding. Marcus. That had to be Marcus Peterson, the drunk driver. But according to David, there was no drunk driver. The car was stolen." I pressed closer to the door, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they'd hear it. "The witness statements," Marcus started, "will be discredited. One's a known drug addict, another has been arrested for public intoxication multiple times. The third." David paused, shuffling through some papers. "Well, let's just say everyone has secrets. The third witness won't be testifying at all." "What does that mean?" "It means you let me worry about the details. Your job is to stick to the story. You were at the country club. The car was stolen. You're as much a victim as anyone else." I must have made some sound, a gasp, a sharp intake of breath, because suddenly both men were looking toward the door. I backed away quickly, padding down the hall as quietly as I could, but I heard David's chair scrape against the floor. "Excuse me a minute," he said to Marcus. I barely made it back to my room before David appeared in the hallway. He stood there for a long moment, looking toward his office, then toward my closed door. I held my breath, pretending to be asleep until I heard his footsteps retreat. The next morning David asked me if I'd slept well. Like a baby, I lied. "Good. You know, Mom, I've been thinking about getting you a white noise machine. Sometimes the old house creaks at night, and I wouldn't want you wandering around in the dark. Easy to get confused, easy to overhear things that might not make sense out of context." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. I smiled and nodded like a good confused old woman. "That sounds nice, dear." But now, sitting in my basement prison with my memory slowly returning, I understood what had really happened. I was the third witness. Somehow, impossibly, I had seen the Peterson accident, and David knew I'd seen it. The pieces were starting to fit together, but I was still missing something crucial. When had I witnessed the accident? I couldn't remember being anywhere that night. Couldn't remember seeing anything that would make me a threat to Marcus Peterson's carefully constructed alibi. But David believed I'd seen something, believed it enough to drug me, imprison me, and systematically destroy my credibility by making me appear mentally incompetent. The question was, what had I seen, and more importantly, how could I prove it before David decided that discrediting me wasn't enough? Before he decided the only way to protect his client, and his own reputation, was to make sure I never testified about anything, ever again. The human mind is like a vast library, and trauma can lock certain sections away behind doors you can't find the keys to. But sometimes, if you're patient and methodical, you can pick those locks. I developed a system. Every morning, after David brought my breakfast and left me alone for his workday, I would sit in the single chair by my makeshift desk and work backwards through time, not randomly but systematically, like a detective investigating my own life. I started with what I knew for certain. The Peterson case involved a hit and run that killed a woman. Marcus Peterson was the real driver, but David had helped him cover it up by claiming the car was stolen. Multiple witnesses had seen the accident, but David was systematically eliminating their credibility, and somehow I was one of those witnesses. But when I hadn't left the house much in the months before David moved me to the basement. My world had grown smaller after I sold my house and moved in with him. Smaller and more controlled, I realized now. I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct that specific night, March 15th. According to the newspaper article I'd managed to piece together. Where had I been on March 15th? What had I been doing? The memory came in fragments, like a movie with missing scenes. I remembered going to bed early, around 9 o'clock. I remembered taking my evening medication, blood pressure pills I'd been on for years, but then there was a gap. A pocket of missing time that the pills David had been giving me had made harder to access. I remembered waking up confused, disoriented, sitting in a chair I didn't remember sitting in. My clothes were different. Instead of my nightgown, I was wearing a coat over my pajamas and my feet were cold, like I'd been walking outside without proper shoes. David had found me there, in the living room chair, around 2 a.m. He'd seemed surprised but not panicked, more like someone who'd been expecting something like this to happen. "Mom, what are you doing up? Were you sleepwalking again?" Again. That word had stuck with me because I'd never sleepwalked in my life. But David had seemed so certain, so concerned that I'd accepted his explanation. "Stress," he'd said. "Grief from Dad's death, even though Dad had been gone for 15 years. Sometimes the mind played tricks when you got older. I'd let him guide me back to my room, let him tuck me in like I was a child. And I'd believed him when he said sleepwalking was normal, when he suggested I see a doctor about it, when that doctor prescribed pills to help me sleep more soundly, pills that made my memory fuzzy, pills that made me more suggestible, pills that made me the perfect unreliable witness. But what if I hadn't been sleepwalking that night? What if I'd been somewhere else entirely, somewhere David needed me not to remember being? I tried a different approach. Instead of trying to remember the missing hours, I focused on the physical evidence. My coat had been damp that night, I remembered now, damp and cold, like it had been outside in the March rain. My pajamas underneath had been dry, which meant I'd put the coat on before going outside. Why would I go outside at midnight in my pajamas? The answer came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over a long night. The cat. Mrs. Patterson's cat, the orange tabby that used to visit our yard every evening. It had been missing for 3 days, and Mrs. Patterson had been beside herself with worry. She'd asked me to keep an eye out, to call her if I saw any sign of him. That night, March 15th, I'd heard something outside. A sound that could have been a cat in distress. I'd thrown on my coat and gone to investigate, bringing a flashlight and a can of the cat food I kept on hand for his visits. I hadn't found the cat, but I had seen something else. The memory was still locked away, but I could feel it there pressing against the walls David's pills had built in my mind. Something important. Something that had made David decide I was a threat that needed to be contained. I needed help. Real help, from someone who could think clearly, who wasn't compromised by whatever cocktail of drugs David had been feeding me. But how do you ask for help when you're locked in a basement, when your own son has convinced the world you're losing your mind? That's when I remembered the hearing aid. It wasn't mine, my hearing was still sharp as a tack. But David had insisted I needed one after I supposedly failed a hearing test I didn't remember taking. The device had been expensive, top of the line with Bluetooth connectivity and noise cancellation features, that seemed excessive for someone who just needed help hearing conversations. I'd worn it for a few weeks to humor him, then stopped when it gave me headaches. It had been sitting in my jewelry box upstairs when David moved me to the basement, forgotten and useless. Or so I'd thought. But now I wondered, what if it wasn't just a hearing aid? What if it was something more? David was a lawyer, not a tech expert, but he had tech-savvy friends. People who might know how to modify a device, how to use it for purposes beyond its original design. I started paying more attention to the subtle sounds around me, the electronic hums and clicks that I'd attributed to the house's old wiring. But some of those sounds seemed to come from specific locations, near the air vents, around the light fixtures, in corners where shadows gathered. David wasn't just keeping me locked up, he was watching me, listening to me. Sure, I wasn't recovering memories I wasn't supposed to have, but two could play that game. I began putting on performances for my invisible audience. Confused conversations with myself about things that didn't matter, rambling stories about my childhood that painted me as increasingly unreliable. Moments of apparent memory loss that reinforced the narrative David was building about my mental decline, all while secretly working to unlock the memory that had landed me in this basement prison. And slowly, very slowly, the truth began to emerge. March 15th, 2:17 a.m. The timestamp was burned into my memory now. though it had taken weeks of careful mental archaeology to uncover it. I'd been outside for 20 minutes, calling softly for Mrs. Patterson's cat, when I heard the sound of an engine accelerating rapidly, too rapidly for a residential street at 2 in the morning. I'd looked up from the bushes where I thought I'd heard a cat, and that's when I saw it. A silver BMW, expensive and sleek, racing down Elm Street like it was being chased by demons. The driver was hunched over the wheel, and even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. The car was weaving slightly, not drunk driving weaving, but the erratic movement of someone in panic. That's when I saw the woman. She was crossing the street from the direction of the late-night diner, probably heading home after her shift. She had earbuds in and was looking at her phone, not paying attention to traffic. Not expecting traffic at that hour on a quiet residential street. The BMW hit her doing at least 50. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not just the impact, but what came after, the horrible silence that follows violence, when the world seems to hold its breath in shock. I dropped the cat food and ran toward the intersection, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The woman was lying in the street, twisted at angles that human bodies aren't meant to bend. Blood was spreading around her head like a dark halo under the streetlight. The BMW had stopped about 30 yards past the intersection. I could see the driver through the rear window, a young man with light hair, sitting perfectly still like he was frozen in time. I reached the woman first. She was still alive, barely. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she was making a sound like air leaking from a balloon. I knelt beside her, not knowing what to do, afraid to move her but desperate to help. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't true. "Help is coming." Except help wasn't coming. I hadn't called anyone yet. My hands were shaking too badly to work my phone, and I couldn't leave her alone in the street. That's when I heard the car door slam. The young man was walking toward us, and even in the dim street, I could see he was well dressed, expensive clothes and shoes that probably cost more than most people made in a month. He moved like someone in shock, mechanically, like his body was operating without input from his brain. When he got close enough for me to see his face clearly, I recognized him, Marcus Peterson. I'd seen his photo in the society pages, at charity events and country club functions. The golden boy of one of the city's most prominent families, recently graduated from law school, engaged to a judge's daughter. He looked down at the woman in the street, and I saw something die in his eyes. "Is she?" he started to ask, then stopped. "She needs an ambulance," I said. "We need to call." "No." The word came out sharp, decisive. "No, we can't. You don't understand. I can't be here. This can't be happening." He pulled out his phone, but instead of calling 911, he dialed another number. "David, it's Marcus. I need you, now. Elm and 3rd Street. There's been an accident. David. My David." Marcus was calling my son. I stared at this young man who was more concerned about his reputation than the dying woman at our feet, and I felt something harden inside me. "She's going to die if we don't get help." "She's going to die anyway," Marcus said quietly. "Look at her." He was right. Even I could see that the woman's injuries were fatal. The light was already fading from her eyes, her breathing becoming more labored. But that didn't mean we should just stand there and let her die alone in the street. I pulled out my own phone to call 911, but Marcus grabbed my wrist. "Please don't. Just wait until David gets here. He'll know what to do. Let go of me. You don't understand. My family, my career, my life. It's all over if this gets out. I've been drinking. I'm probably over the limit. There are photos of me at the bar tonight, witnesses who saw me drinking. Even if it wasn't my fault, even if she walked out in front of me, they'll crucify me. Then you should have thought of that before you got behind the wheel." But even as I said it, I found myself hesitating. This boy was scared, genuinely terrified, and something in his panic reminded me of David at the same age. Lost, desperate, making mistakes that would follow him forever. The woman in the street made a sound like a sigh, and then she was still. Marcus and I stood there in silence, looking down at her, both of us understanding that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. She was dead, and we were witnesses to our own inaction. That's when David arrived. He must have broken every speed limit getting there, because it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes since Marcus called. He parked his car at the curb, and walked over to us with the calm, measured steps of someone who'd done this before. "Mom," he said when he saw me, "what are you doing out here?" "I was looking for Mrs. Patterson's cat when I saw the accident." David looked from me to Marcus to the dead woman in the street, and I watched him perform some internal calculation. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Professional. Cold. "Marcus, get back in your car and drive home. Don't stop, don't talk to anyone. When you get there, park in your garage and don't come out until I call you. But what about out? I'll handle it. Go, now." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in David's tone brooked no discussion. He walked back to his BMW, got in and drove away, leaving me alone with my son and a dead woman. Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully, David said. You were never here tonight. You never saw any of this. You were home, asleep in your bed. You've been having problems with sleepwalking lately, remember? Sometimes you think you've been places you haven't been. David, what are you talking about? We can't just leave her here. We're not leaving her. I'm going to call 911 in exactly 5 minutes. An anonymous tip about a hit and run, but you are going home right now, and you're going to forget this ever happened. I can't do that. Yes, you can. Because if you don't, Marcus Peterson's life is ruined. And do you know what happens to me if the Peterson family's golden boy goes down for vehicular manslaughter? Do you know how much money I stand to lose? How many other clients will drop me if word gets out that I couldn't protect their interests? I stared at my son, this man I'd raised and sacrificed for, and saw a stranger looking back at me. She's dead, David. A woman is dead and you're worried about money? I'm worried about our future, your future. Do you think your medical bills pay themselves? Do you think that nice house we're living in is free? Everything we have depends on my reputation, my client relationships. And if those are destroyed because you can't keep your mouth shut about something that's already over and done with, where does that leave us? He pulled out a small bottle of pills, the same ones he'd been giving me for my anxiety. Take 2 of these. They'll help you sleep, help you forget. In the morning, this will all seem like a bad dream. I'm not taking anything. Mom. His voice hardened. You're confused. You've been having episodes. Just last week you were convinced someone had broken into the house and stolen your jewelry. Remember? Even though we found it exactly where you left it. You're getting paranoid, seeing things that aren't there. The stress of Dad's death is catching up with you. Dad had been dead for 15 years. Take the pills, Mom. For both our sakes. I looked at the bottle in his hand, then at the dead woman in the street, then back at my son's face. And I realized that this wasn't the first time we'd had this conversation. The gaps in my memory, the confusion, the sense that time was slipping away from me. It wasn't age or stress or grief. It was David. He'd been drugging me for months, maybe longer. Keeping me compliant, manageable, unreliable. And now I understood why. I wasn't his first inconvenient witness. Okay, I said quietly. Give me the pills. He handed me the bottle and watched while I dry swallowed 2 of them, just like he'd trained me to do. But I'd learned a trick in my basement prison. How to palm pills, how to hide them under my tongue, how to seem compliant while staying alert. Good girl, he said, and the condescension in his voice made my skin crawl. Now let's get you home. He walked me back to the house, settled me in my chair and waited until the pills he thought I'd taken would have kicked in. Then he left to make his anonymous 911 call and begin the process of turning Marcus Peterson from a drunk driver into a victim of car theft. But I hadn't taken the pills. I was wide awake, completely alert, and for the first time in months, I could think clearly. I knew what I had to do. Living with a secret is like carrying a stone in your chest. It grows heavier each day until you can barely breathe around it. But sometimes that stone becomes your foundation, the solid truth you stand on when everything else is shifting sand. I spent the weeks after that night watching David transform into someone I barely recognized. Or maybe he'd always been this person, and I'd been too drugged to see it clearly. He was methodical in his cover-up, efficient as a surgeon removing evidence of his involvement. The Peterson case moved through the system exactly as he'd planned. Marcus was portrayed as another victim, a young man whose car had been stolen by joyriders who used it to commit a hit and run. The real witnesses were discredited one by one, just as David had promised. The drug addict suddenly had a warrant issued for his arrest on unrelated charges and fled the state. The man with multiple DUI arrests was found with a trunk full of stolen merchandise and was too busy fighting felony theft charges to worry about testifying in a hit-and-run case. And then there was me. David began his campaign against my credibility the very next day. Subtle at first, concerned conversations with neighbors about my increasing confusion, appointments with doctors who specialized in elderly care, doctors who were quick to diagnose dementia, based on carefully curated evidence of my decline. She's been having episodes, I heard him tell Dr. Morrison during what I thought was a routine checkup, claiming to see things that didn't happen, getting confused about where she's been. Last night she insisted she'd been outside during the storm, but I found her asleep in her chair. She was soaking wet though, so maybe she was outside and blocked it out. There had been no storm that night. I hadn't been wet, but Dr. Morrison made notes in my file, nodding sympathetically as David painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on reality. The pills increased. Now I was taking medication for anxiety, for depression, for sleep, for cognitive issues. A rainbow of capsules and tablets that David carefully doled out each morning and evening. watching to make sure I swallowed every one. Except I wasn't swallowing them anymore. I'd become an expert at deception, hiding pills under my tongue, palming them while David was distracted, building up a collection of chemical evidence that I kept hidden in an old jewelry box he'd missed when moving my things to the basement. Because by then I understood that the basement wasn't a safety measure. It was a waiting room, a place to keep me contained while David decided how to handle the witness problem I represented. The first time he mentioned the nursing home, I felt that stone in my chest turn to ice. I've been thinking, Mom, maybe it's time we looked into some specialized care for you, somewhere with professionals who understand what you're going through. We were sitting in the basement, David perched on the edge of my bed while I pretended to work on a crossword puzzle. He'd brought me dinner, soup and crackers, easy to digest, easy to doctor with medication if needed. I'm fine here, I said, not looking up from the puzzle. Are you though? You seem so isolated down here, so cut off from the world. At Sunset Manor you'd have other people to talk to, activities to keep you engaged. They have an excellent memory care unit. Memory care. Such a pleasant euphemism for a place where inconvenient people disappear. I don't want to go to a nursing home. I know it's scary, but Mom, I think it might be for the best. You're getting worse. Last week you asked me 3 times in one day when Dad was when home, and yesterday you called me Robert. Robert had been my brother's name, my brother who died in Vietnam 50 years ago. I had never not once confused David with Robert. But David was building his case, constructing a narrative of decline that would justify whatever came next. Maybe I could just try it for a few days, I said, playing along. See how I like it. David's face lit up with what might have been genuine relief. Really, you'd be willing to do that, if you think it's best? But I had no intention of going quietly to any nursing home. I was done being David's compliant victim, done letting him drug me into submission while he covered up his crimes. It was time to start fighting back. That night after David had gone to bed I began planning my escape, not from the basement, that was impossible with the electronic lock he'd installed, but an escape of a different kind. A way to get my story out, to expose what David had done, to ensure that even if something happened to me the truth would survive. I started with the pills. Over the months of his systematic poisoning, I'd managed to save dozens of them. Anxiety medication, antipsychotics, memory inhibitors, a pharmacological cocktail designed to keep me confused and compliant. I wrapped them carefully in tissue paper and hid them inside the lining of my winter coat, along with a detailed letter explaining what each pill was and when David had tried to force me to take it. Then I turned my attention to documentation. David thought he was so clever with his electronic surveillance, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He assumed I was too far gone to notice the tiny cameras hidden in the smoke detectors, too confused to spot the listening devices tucked behind picture frames. But I'd been cataloging every piece of surveillance equipment in my basement prison, and I knew exactly where to position myself to avoid their electronic eyes and ears. I began writing my story on scraps of paper, hiding each page inside books David had brought me to stimulate my mind. Romance novels and easy mysteries that he assumed I'd never actually read. Little did he know I was using them as a filing system for the most important document I'd ever written. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed a way to get my evidence to someone who could act on it, someone David couldn't intimidate or buy off. The problem was that David had systematically isolated me from everyone I'd once trusted. My sister Ellen thought I had dementia and wasn't taking my calls seriously. My old friends had been told I was having a difficult time and needed space to focus on my health. That's when I remembered Detective Sarah Chen. 3 years ago, there had been a break-in attempt at my old house. Nothing was taken, but someone had tried to force the back door while I was at church. Detective Chen had been the responding officer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd taken the time to walk me through proper security measures and check in on me several times afterward. More importantly, she'd given me her card and told me to call if I ever felt unsafe for any reason. Sometimes older residents are targeted by scammers or family members with bad intentions, she'd said. Don't hesitate to reach out if something doesn't feel right. I still had her card, tucked inside my Bible where David wouldn't think to look for it. The question was how to contact her without David knowing. The answer came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Patterson. I could see her house from the small window near the basement stairs, and I'd noticed she still put out food for her missing cat every evening. The cat that had been killed the same night as the hit and run, I realized, probably by the same car, which would explain why I'd heard what sounded like an animal in distress just before witnessing the accident. Mrs. Patterson was in her 80s, lived alone, and had always been kind to me. More importantly, she was one of the few people in the neighborhood who hadn't been subjected to David's carefully crafted stories about my mental decline. I waited for the right moment, a day when David was in court and wouldn't be home until evening. Then I did something I hadn't done since being locked in the basement. I fought back. The lock on the basement door was electronic, controlled by a keypad on the outside. But electronic locks need power, and the basement's electrical system was older than David realized. I'd been watching the patterns, listening to the subtle sounds of the house's electrical grid, and I'd noticed something interesting. When Mrs. Patterson used her microwave, which she did every day at exactly 11:30 to heat her lunch, it caused a brief power fluctuation that affected the whole street. For about 30 seconds, electronic devices would flicker or reset. On Tuesday morning, I positioned myself at the basement door at exactly 11:30. When the power flickered, the electronic lock reset to its default state, unlocked for 60 seconds to allow manual override in case of emergency. I was up the stairs and out the front door before the lock could re-engage. The morning air felt like freedom, sharp and clean after months of basement stainless. I didn't have long, maybe 15 minutes before David's security system alerted him that I'd left the house. But 15 minutes was enough. Mrs. Patterson answered her door in a floral housecoat, her eyes wide with surprise. "Margaret, I haven't seen you in ages. David said you'd been under the weather." "Mrs. Patterson, I need your help, and I need you to listen very carefully because I don't have much time." I gave her Detective Chen's card and explained as quickly as I could that I was in danger, that David had been holding me against my will, but there were things about the night her cat disappeared that she needed to know. "Call Detective Chen," I said. "Tell her Margaret Walsh needs help. Tell her it's about the Peterson case. She'll understand." Mrs. Patterson looked confused but nodded. "Of course, dear. Are you all right? You look so thin." He picked up the syringe, checked to make sure it hadn't been damaged, and started walking toward me. "I was going to make this easy for you. But now it's going to hurt." That's when we heard the sirens, faint at first, then growing louder, coming down our street with the urgency that meant someone's world was about to change forever. David froze, his head tilted toward the ceiling, listening. The sirens stopped right outside our house. Car doors slamming, heavy footsteps on the front porch. The authoritative knock that couldn't be ignored. "Police, open the door." David looked at me, then at the syringe in his hand. I saw him making rapid calculations. He could kill me right now, claim I'd attacked him in a delusional rage and he'd defended himself. But that would be hard to explain with me locked in a basement and him holding an unlabeled syringe. "David Walsh, this is Detective Chen. We have a warrant to search the premises." A warrant. Which meant Detective Chen had found enough evidence to convince a judge that something criminal was happening in this house. David slipped the syringe back into his jacket pocket and smoothed his hair, transforming himself back into the respectable lawyer he pretended to be. "Stay here," he said to me as if I had any choice. "Don't say anything stupid." He climbed the stairs and opened the basement door, and I heard his voice drift down as he greeted the police with professional courtesy. "Officers, this is highly irregular. If you have questions about my client's case, you should go through proper channels. This isn't about the Peterson case, Mr. Walsh." Detective Chen's voice was sharp, cutting through David's lawyer speak. "This is about your mother. My mother is ill. She's been having episodes making up stories. I can provide medical documentation. We'd like to see her, please. She's resting. She had a difficult night, very agitated. The doctor had to sedate her. Nevertheless, we need to speak with her directly." I could hear the conversation moving toward the basement stairs, and I realized this was my moment. My one chance to tell the truth before David could spin it into something else. When Detective Chen appeared at the bottom of the stairs, followed by 2 uniformed officers, I was ready for her. "Detective Chen, thank God you came. David has been holding me prisoner down here for months. He's been drugging me to keep me quiet about what I witnessed. The Peterson case. I saw the real accident. I can prove Marcus Peterson was driving that night." David started to interrupt to explain about my confusion and my medical condition, but Detective Chen held up a hand to silence him. "Mrs. Walsh, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" I gestured to David's bleeding temple. "He tried to inject me with something when he realized you were investigating. I had to defend myself." One of the officers immediately moved to David's side, ostensibly to check his injury but actually to keep him from interfering further. "Mrs. Walsh, I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. Take your time." So I did. I told her about the night I witnessed the hit and run, about David's involvement in the cover-up, about the months of systematic drugging and imprisonment. I told her about the pills I'd hidden, the documentation I'd been keeping, the evidence that David was not just covering up a crime but had been committing crimes of his own. Detective Chen listened without interruption, taking notes, asking clarifying questions that showed she understood the scope of what David had been doing. When I finished, she turned to David. "Mr. Walsh, you're under arrest for unlawful imprisonment, elder abuse, and obstruction of justice." We'll start with those charges and see what else develops as we investigate. As the officers handcuffed my son, he looked at me with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've just done, he said. No idea how many people this is going to destroy. I know exactly what I've done, I replied. I've told the truth, but even as Detective Chen helped me up the stairs and out of my basement prison, even as paramedics checked me over, and social workers made arrangements for my immediate care, I knew this was only the beginning. David had been right about one thing. This was going to destroy a lot of people. But sometimes destruction is necessary before you can build something better. And I was ready to watch his entire house of lies come crashing down. The evidence room at the police station looked like a pharmacist's nightmare. Dozens of pills scattered across the metal table, each one carefully catalogued and photographed. The rainbow of medications David had been feeding me for months, now serving as proof of his systematic campaign to destroy my credibility. Detective Chen sat across from me, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands and a legal pad covered with notes at her elbow. It had been 6 hours since my rescue from the basement, and we'd been talking almost continuously, building a timeline of David's crimes that stretched back further than even I had realized. The lab results will take a few days, she said, but the preliminary tests on these pills are concerning. Half of them aren't even prescribed medications, they're research chemicals, experimental compounds that aren't approved for human use. I wrapped my hands around my own coffee cup, still not quite believing I was free to hold something warm, free to sit in a chair I'd chosen, free to speak without David monitoring every word. I will be. But I have to go back now before David knows I was gone. Just please, call Detective Chen. Today. I made it back to the basement with 2 minutes to spare. My heart pounding but my mind clearer than it had been in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I'd taken action. I'd reached out beyond David's carefully constructed walls. Now I could only wait and hope that Mrs. Patterson would follow through. That Detective Chen would remember me. That someone would care enough to investigate before David decided that containing me wasn't enough anymore. Because I could see the calculation in his eyes every time he looked at me now. I was becoming more trouble than I was worth, more risk than reward. And David had already shown me exactly how he dealt with inconvenient problems. The Peterson case was scheduled to be dismissed the following week. All charges dropped, all witnesses silenced, all evidence that Marcus Peterson had ever been behind the wheel that night carefully erased. All except me. And David was running out of ways to keep me quiet. Detective Chen arrived on Thursday morning while David was at the courthouse, putting the finishing touches on Marcus Peterson's vindication. I watched from my basement window as she spoke with Mrs. Patterson, saw the older woman pointing toward our house and handing over what looked like my handwritten note. Detective Chen studied the house for a long moment, and I could see her making the same calculations I'd been making for months. Something was wrong here, something that went beyond normal family concerns about an aging parent. She knocked on the front door, and when no one answered, she walked around the perimeter of the house, noting the bars David had installed on the basement windows. The security cameras pointed inward rather than outward, the reinforced locks that were meant to keep someone in rather than keep intruders out. I pressed myself against the small window and knocked softly on the glass. Detective Chen looked up, and our eyes met for just a moment before I heard David's car in the driveway. He was home early. I moved away from the window as quickly as I could, settling back into my chair with a book open on my lap, but my heart was racing, and I could barely focus on the words on the page. I heard voices upstairs, David's smooth, professional tone mixing with Detective Chen's more direct questions. I couldn't make out specific words, but I could hear the rhythm of the conversation, the way David deflected and redirected while Chen pressed for clearer answers. After about 20 minutes, I heard the front door close and Detective Chen's car pull away. David's footsteps on the stairs told me everything I needed to know about how the conversation had gone. "Mom," he said as he entered my basement room, "we need to talk." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl, a cold fury that he was working very hard to control. "Detective Chen came by today," she said. "Mrs. Patterson called her with some concerning information about your well-being." I looked up from my book, trying to project the innocent confusion he expected to see. "Detective Chen? I don't know any Detective Chen." She said, "You gave Mrs. Patterson her business card. Said you told her you were in danger." "I haven't talked to Mrs. Patterson in months, David. I've been down here the whole time." "I know that, which is why Detective Chen's visit was so puzzling. Someone's been telling stories, Mom. Someone's been spreading lies about our family." He sat down on the edge of my bed and I noticed he was wearing gloves. Latex gloves, like the ones doctors use during examinations. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your condition, about what's real and what's just your mind playing tricks on you." He pulled out a syringe from his jacket pocket, the needle gleaming under the fluorescent lights. This will help you feel better. Help you think more clearly. What is that? Just something to calm your nerves. You've been agitated lately, seeing things that aren't there, talking to people who don't exist. Doctor Morrison thinks a stronger medication might help. I stood up from my chair, backing toward the far wall. I don't want any medication. I know you don't. But Mom, you're not competent to make that decision anymore. I have power of attorney, remember, medical decisions are my responsibility now. Power of attorney. When had I signed a power of attorney? I couldn't remember agreeing to any such thing, but then again there were so many gaps in my memory from the months when David was drugging me heavily. I want to see the document. The document isn't important right now. What's important is getting you the help you need. He moved toward me with the syringe, and I realized with crystal clarity that this wasn't about medical treatment. This was about silencing me permanently. Whatever was in that syringe would either kill me outright or damage my brain so severely that I'd never be a credible witness to anything. David, please. I'm your mother. I know exactly who you are, and I know what you saw that night, what you think you saw. So he wasn't even pretending anymore. The mask was finally off. I saw Marcus Peterson kill that woman. I saw you help him cover it up. You saw a confused old woman having a breakdown in her own front yard. You saw hallucinations brought on by medication interactions and progressive dementia. That's what every doctor who examines you will conclude, especially after you've had an adverse reaction to your anxiety medication. He was close enough now that I could see my reflection in his eyes. My son who I'd loved unconditionally, who I'd sacrificed everything for, looking at me like I was nothing more than a problem to be solved. The Peterson family pays me very well to make their problems go away, he continued. And you, Mom, are their biggest problem. But don't worry, it'll be quick. They'll find you in the morning, having had a tragic reaction to medication you took voluntarily. A confused woman who took too many pills, trying to quiet the voices in her head. He lunged forward with the syringe, but I was ready for him. Months of forced confinement had made me weak, but it had also made me desperate, and desperate people fight harder than anyone expects. I grabbed the lamp from my bedside table and swung it at his head with every ounce of strength I had left. The ceramic base shattered against his temple, and he stumbled backward, dropping the syringe. Blood was trickling down the side of his face, but he was still conscious, still dangerous. I ran for the stairs, knowing that my only chance was to get out of the basement, to get to neighbors who could witness whatever David did next. But the door was locked, of course. The electronic keypad blinked red in the dim stairwell, and I realized that David had probably changed the code after my escape earlier in the week. I pounded on the door screaming for help, but the house was built solidly, and the basement was designed to contain sound. No one would hear me. Behind me, David was getting to his feet, wiping blood from his face with his sleeve. He looked more annoyed than injured, like I'd knocked over a glass of water instead of potentially giving him a concussion. That was a mistake, Mom. Where would he get something like that? That's what we're trying to figure out. But Mr. Walsh has some interesting connections. Pharmaceutical companies, research facilities, medical professionals who specialize in clinical trials for cognitive disorders. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're saying he was experimenting on me? I'm saying the medications you were given were designed to produce very specific symptoms. Memory loss, confusion, inability to form new memories clearly. Someone with access to cutting-edge research knew exactly what cocktail of drugs would make you appear mentally incompetent while keeping you physically healthy enough to survive long-term. Long-term, as in David had been planning to keep me drugged and imprisoned for years, not just until the Peterson case was resolved. There's something else, Detective Chen continued. We executed a search warrant on your son's office this morning. His client files make for very interesting reading. She pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across the table. David Walsh has been specializing in what he calls reputation management for wealthy families. When their children get into trouble, DUI cases, assault charges, white-collar crimes, he doesn't just provide legal representation, he provides complete problem elimination. I looked at the documents, seeing names I recognized from newspaper society pages, families whose scandals had mysteriously disappeared from public attention. The Morrison family, Detective Chen pointed to one file. Their son killed a family of 4 while driving under the influence 3 years ago. Officially, he was never even in the car that night. The charges were dropped when all the witnesses recanted their statements. Recanted or were silenced. 2 of the witnesses moved out of state suddenly, with significant financial windfalls they couldn't explain. The 3rd witness died of an apparent overdose 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin. My blood turned to ice. Ellen Martinez, age 43, mother of 2, found in her apartment with enough heroin in her system to kill a horse. Except Ellen Martinez had no history of drug use, and the coroner found injection marks that suggested someone else had administered the drugs. I stared at the photograph of Ellen Martinez, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and realized I was looking at what might have been my own future. If Detective Chen hadn't responded to Mrs. Patterson's call, if I hadn't managed to hide those pills, if David's plan had proceeded just a little further. How many? I asked quietly. How many what? How many witnesses has he eliminated over the years? Detective Chen's expression was grim. We're still counting. But Mrs. Walsh, your son hasn't just been covering up crimes, he's been committing them, and he's been very, very good at it. She showed me more files, more cases where David had made inconvenient people disappear, not always through murder. Sometimes through discrediting, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through forced relocation. But always thoroughly, always permanently. The Peterson case was supposed to be his masterpiece, Detective Chen continued, a high-profile family, a crime with multiple witnesses, a victim whose death would normally demand justice. But David saw it as an opportunity to prove his value to the city's most powerful families. By eliminating everyone who could testify against Marcus Peterson. Exactly. And you were the last loose end. I thought about the syringe David had been holding when the police arrived, about the cold calculation in his eyes as he'd prepared to inject me with whatever cocktail would finally silence me forever. What happens now? Now we build a case. Not just against your son but against the entire network of people who've been paying him to cover up their crimes. The Peterson family, the Morrison family, the Blackwood family, they're all going down. She pulled out another document, this one with my name at the top. But first we need your official statement about what you witnessed the night of March 15th. Everything you remember, every detail you can provide. Your testimony is going to be the foundation that brings down this entire operation. I looked at the statement form, remembering how hard I'd fought to preserve my memories while David was trying to erase them. All those nights in the basement, writing my story on scraps of paper, hiding the truth in book pages and jewelry boxes, fighting to keep my mind clear while he pumped me full of chemicals designed to steal my thoughts. There's something else you should know, I said. The night of the accident, David didn't just help Marcus cover it up. He was already there when Marcus called him. Detective Chen looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean David arrived too quickly. Marcus called him from the scene, and David was there within 10 minutes. At 2:30 in the morning, nobody gets dressed and drives across town that fast unless they were already awake, already prepared. You think David knew the accident was going to happen? I think David knew Marcus was going to drive drunk that night. I think he was following him, maybe even encouraging him to get behind the wheel. And when the inevitable happened, David was ready to clean up the mess. The implications of what I was suggesting hung in the air between us. Not just cover up after the fact but premeditated conspiracy. David hadn't just been cleaning up his clients' messes, he'd been creating situations where they'd need his services. Mrs. Walsh, if you're right about this, we're not just looking at obstruction of justice or even conspiracy. We're looking at first-degree murder charges. I thought about the woman who died in the street that night, about the family who would never know that her death wasn't just a random tragedy but a planned execution, about all the other victims whose deaths David had orchestrated or enabled in the name of protecting his wealthy clients. Then let's make sure he pays for all of it. Detective Chen nodded and turned to a fresh page in her legal pad. Start from the beginning, she said. Tell me everything you remember about March 15th. And don't leave out any details, no matter how small they seem. So I began my testimony, the most important words I'd ever spoken, the truth that David had tried so hard to bury, now rising from the grave to destroy him. But even as I spoke, I knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning. David's arrest would send shockwaves through the city's elite families, would expose decades of corruption and cover-ups that reached into every level of local government and society. Some very powerful people were about to discover that their darkest secrets were no longer safe, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. The story broke on a Thursday morning, splashed across the front page of the city newspaper, with a headline that sent tremors through every mansion and country club in the metropolitan area. Prominent auteur arrested in witness elimination scheme. I read it from my wassail bed, where I'd been recovering from months of systematic poisoning. The doctors said I was lucky. The combination of drugs David had been giving me could have caused permanent brain damage if I'd continued taking them much longer. Lucky. I suppose that was one way to look at it. The article detailed David's arrest, my rescue from the basement, and the beginning of what prosecutors were calling the largest corruption investigation in the city's history. But it was the sidebar story that really caught my attention. Peterson family hires crisis management team. They were already circling the wagons, already trying to contain the damage. But some things can't be contained once they start spilling out. Detective Chen visited me every day, bringing new developments in the case and new evidence of just how deep David's operation had gone. The search of his office had revealed files on dozens of wealthy families, detailed plans for eliminating witnesses, and financial records that showed millions of dollars changing hands over the years. "We found something else," she said on Friday morning, settling into the visitor's chair with a cup of coffee and a manila folder. "Something about your husband's death." My heart stopped. Richard died of a heart attack 15 years ago. According to the medical examiner, yes. But David had a file on him too. She opened the folder and showed me photographs of medical records, insurance documents, and what looked like a detailed timeline of Richard's final weeks. "Your husband was asking questions about David's law practice." According to these notes, Richard had discovered some irregularities in David's client accounts, possible ethics violations that could have gotten him disbarred. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. Richard never said anything to me about that, because David convinced him to stay quiet. "Look at this." She showed me a letter in Richard's handwriting, addressed to the State Bar Association but never sent. In it, my husband detailed suspicious payments David had received, clients who seemed to be paying far more than standard legal fees, and cases that were resolved through methods that seemed legally questionable. Richard was going to report his own son. Richard was going to save his son before it was too late. But David couldn't risk that kind of scrutiny. Detective Chen showed me the final document in the folder, Richard's medical records from the night he died. A heart attack, yes, but one that had been induced by a massive dose of a heart medication he wasn't prescribed to take. "The same kind of untraceable drug cocktail David was using on you," she said quietly, "administered in a way that would look like natural causes to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it." The room started spinning around me. I gripped the bed rails, trying to process what she was telling me. David killed his own father? We think so. And then he spent the next 15 years perfecting his methods on other inconvenient witnesses. I thought about all the times David had comforted me after Richard's death, all the ways he'd helped me through my grief, all the moments I'd been grateful to have such a caring son during the worst period of my life. He'd been comforting me for a death he'd caused, helping me through grief he'd created. "There's more," Detective Chen continued. "We've been in touch with other law enforcement agencies, and David's methods have been noticed before. Missing witnesses in high-profile cases, suspicious deaths that were ruled accidental or natural, people who simply disappeared when they became inconvenient to powerful families." She pulled out a map of the United States with red pins marking locations across multiple states. "We think David's operation was much larger than just our city. He was consulting for lawyers and fixers across the country, teaching them his methods, helping them establish their own witness elimination networks. How many people has he killed? We may never know the exact number. But Mrs. Walsh, we believe your son was responsible for at least 30 deaths over the past 15 years, possibly more. 30 people, 30 families destroyed so that wealthy criminals could escape consequences for their actions. 30 lives snuffed out by my son, the boy I'd raised to believe in justice and compassion." "I need to see him," I said. Detective Chen looked surprised. "Mrs. Walsh, I don't think that's a good idea. David is extremely manipulative, and you're still recovering from months of psychological abuse. Seeing him could set back your recovery. I need to look him in the eye and hear him admit what he's done. I need to understand how the child I raised became capable of this." After some discussion with the prosecutors and my doctors, it was arranged. David was being held without bail at the county jail, facing charges that would likely keep him locked up for the rest of his life. The meeting would take place in a secured conference room with guards present and Detective Chen monitoring everything. I hadn't seen David since the night of his arrest, and I was shocked by how much he'd changed in just 2 weeks. The confident, polished lawyer was gone, replaced by a man who looked older, smaller, more fragile. His hair was unkempt, his orange jumpsuit wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. But when he looked at me across the metal table, his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and entirely without remorse. "Hello, Mom, David." We sat in silence for a moment, staring at each other across the chasm that had opened between us. "How do you talk to someone who tried to kill you? How do you find words for that kind of betrayal? I suppose you're proud of yourself," he said finally, "destroying everything I built, ruining all those families." "You mean the families whose crimes you were covering up?" "I mean the families who trusted me to protect them from people like you. People who don't understand that sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices." "The greater good, David, you murdered 30 people. I prevented chaos. Do you have any idea what would happen if every rich family's secrets were exposed? The economy would collapse. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. The social order that keeps this city functioning would crumble." He leaned forward, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the passionate idealism he'd shown as a child. I was protecting society, Mom. Those people I eliminated were threats to the stability that benefits everyone. Their individual lives were a small price to pay for the greater good. What about Richard? What greater good was served by murdering your own father? David's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Dad was going to destroy everything I'd worked for. Everything I'd built. He would have ruined me over some misguided sense of legal ethics. He was trying to save you. He was trying to destroy me. Just like you did. I stared at my son, this stranger wearing a familiar face, and realized that the boy I'd raised had died years ago. Maybe he'd died the first time David had decided that other people's lives were expendable for his benefit. Maybe he'd died the moment he'd chosen money and power over truth and justice. I didn't destroy you, David. You destroyed yourself. And you destroyed me in the process. You're still here. Barely you have any idea what those drugs did to me. What it felt like to lose pieces of my mind, to doubt my own memories, to feel myself disappearing little by little. For the first time, something that might have been shame crossed his features, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. It was necessary. You would have ruined everything. I would have told the truth. Same thing. I stood up from the table, suddenly exhausted by the conversation. I'd hoped to find some remnant of the son I'd loved, some hint of the child who'd once brought me flowers and told me he wanted to be a lawyer to help people. But there was nothing left of that boy. David had killed him along with all his other victims. I'm sorry, Mom, he said as the guards moved to escort him back to his cell. I'm sorry it had to end this way. But he wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught. As I watched my son being led away in shackles, I felt something inside me break and heal at the same time. The child I'd loved was gone, had been gone for years. But I was still here. Still alive, still capable of seeking justice for all the people he'd harmed. It was time to make sure their stories were told. The courthouse was packed the day I testified against David. Media crews lined the sidewalks, reporters shouted questions that I didn't answer, and cameras flashed as Detective Chen escorted me through the crowd. Inside, the gallery was filled with families of David's victims, their faces a mixture of grief and hope that justice might finally be served. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, had spent weeks preparing me for this moment. She was a small woman with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, and she'd made it clear that my testimony would be the cornerstone of the case against not just David but the entire network of wealthy families who had paid him to eliminate their problems. Mrs. Walsh, she said as I took the witness stand, I know this is difficult. Take your time and tell us in your own words what happened on the night of March 15th. I looked out at the packed courtroom, at David sitting at the defense table in his expensive suit, at the families in the gallery who needed to hear the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. And I began to speak. I told them about hearing what I thought was a cat in distress, about going outside in my pajamas and coat to investigate. I described watching Marcus Peterson's BMW speed down Elm Street, seeing the woman crossing the street with her earbuds in, hearing the terrible sound of impact. The defendant's client, Marcus Peterson, was clearly intoxicated, I testified. When he got out of the car and approached the victim, his first concern wasn't her welfare. It was protecting himself. I described Marcus's phone call to David, the conversation I'd overheard about alibis and stolen cars and witness elimination. I told them about David's arrival at the scene, his calm, professional manner as he instructed Marcus to leave and began orchestrating the cover-up. He told me I'd never been there, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. He told me I was confused, that I'd been sleepwalking, that what I'd witnessed was just a hallucination brought on by stress and medication. What medication was the defendant referring to? Adia Santos asked. Pills he'd been giving me for months. Pills he said were for anxiety and memory problems, but which I later learned were experimental drugs designed to destroy my cognitive function. I reached into my purse and pulled out the bottle of pills I'd saved, the evidence that had helped convict David of elder abuse and attempted murder. I stopped taking these pills and began hiding them instead, and as the drugs left my system, my memory of that night became clearer. I remembered every detail of what I'd witnessed, every word of David's instructions to Marcus Peterson, every step of the cover-up they orchestrated. David's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Harrison Webb, stood to object. Your Honor, the witness has admitted to having memory problems and taking medication that affected her cognitive function. Her testimony is inherently unreliable. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been following the case closely, looked at him with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Webb, your client is the one who administered those drugs to compromise Mrs. Walsh's memory. You can't use the effects of your client's criminal actions to discredit his victim's testimony. Objection overruled. I continued my testimony, describing the months of imprisonment in the basement, the systematic poisoning. David's escalating threats as the Peterson case moved toward resolution. I told them about the night he'd tried to inject me with what was later determined to be a lethal dose of potassium chloride, about fighting for my life against my own son. Why do you think the defendant went to such elaborate lengths to discredit you? Adia Santos asked. Because my testimony would have exposed not just the Peterson cover-up, but his entire. David wasn't just a lawyer representing wealthy clients. He was a criminal who specialized in eliminating witnesses to protect other criminals. I looked directly at David as I said this, and for the first time since his arrest he seemed to shrink in his chair. He'd been perfecting his methods for years. I believe he murdered my husband Richard in 2008, when Richard discovered irregularities in David's practice. And over the following 15 years he murdered or disappeared dozens of other people who threatened to expose his clients' crimes. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of people crying. In the gallery I could see family members of David's victims holding each other, finally hearing someone speak the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. David's cross-examination was brutal but ineffective. Harrison Webb tried every angle he could think of: my age, the medications I'd been given, the stress of the situation, the possibility that I was seeking revenge against a son who'd made difficult decisions about my care. But I'd spent months preparing for this moment, months fighting to preserve my memory and my sanity against David's systematic assault. I wasn't the confused, drugged woman he'd tried to create. I was angry, clear-headed and determined to see justice done. Mrs. Walsh, Webb said during his questioning, isn't it true that your son was simply trying to provide you with the medical care you needed, that your episode in the basement was the result of a psychotic break brought on by your deteriorating mental condition? Mr. Webb, I replied calmly. Your client locked me in a basement for 4 months, drugged me with experimental chemicals, and tried to kill me with a lethal injection when he realized I could expose his crimes. If that's your definition of medical care, I'd hate to see what you consider abuse. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Morrison had to call for order. The testimony continued for 3 days. Other witnesses corroborated parts of my story. Mrs. Lee Patterson, who'd seen me outside the night of the accident, Detective Chen, who described the evidence found in David's office, medical experts who explained the effects of the drugs David had been giving me, forensic accountants who traced the money flowing between David and his wealthy clients. But the most damning testimony came from an unexpected source: Marcus Peterson himself. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of life in prison, Marcus had decided to cooperate with the prosecution. He took the stand on the 4th day of the trial, pale and shaking, and told the truth about what had happened that night. I'd been drinking at the Meridian Club, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. David Walsh was there too at the bar. He kept buying me drinks, encouraging me to live a little since my engagement party was the next week. Did Mr. Walsh suggest you drive home that night? Adia Santos asked. Not directly, but when I said I should call a cab he said I was being paranoid, said I hadn't had that much to drink, that the drive was only a few miles. He even walked me to my car and helped me get in. What happened next? I drove home. I was probably over the legal limit, but I thought I was okay. Then I saw the woman crossing the street, and I tried to stop, but it was too late. Marcus's voice broke as he described the impact, the terrible sound of it, the sight of the woman lying in the street. I called David because I was panicking. I didn't know what else to do, and he had an answer for everything. Like he'd been planning it. What do you mean? He knew exactly what to do. He had the story ready, about my car being stolen, about the alibi at the club. He even knew which mechanics to call, which witnesses to discredit. It was like he'd done it before. The implication hung in the air like smoke. David hadn't just covered up Marcus's crime, he'd orchestrated it. He'd gotten the young man drunk, encouraged him to drive, then positioned himself to profit from the inevitable tragedy that followed. During cross-examination, Harrison Webb tried to portray Marcus as a desperate man trying to shift blame to save himself. But the evidence was overwhelming. Phone records showing multiple calls between David and Marcus in the weeks before the accident. Financial records showing large payments from the Peterson family to David's firm. Testimony from bartenders who remembered David specifically targeting Marcus that night, buying him drinks and encouraging reckless behavior. David hadn't just been cleaning up his clients' messes, he'd been creating them. The closing arguments were devastating. Adia Santos laid out the full scope of David's criminal enterprise, from his father's murder in 2008 to the attempted murder of his own mother in 2023. She presented evidence linking him to at least 12 other suspicious deaths, showed the jury the elaborate system he'd built to eliminate witnesses and protect wealthy criminals. David Walsh didn't just practice law, she said in her final statement to the jury. He practiced evil, he turned the justice system into a weapon against the innocent, used his knowledge and connections to help the worst people in our society escape consequences for their actions, and when his own mother threatened to expose him, he tried to murder her too. She pointed to where I sat in the gallery, surrounded by families of David's other victims. Margaret Walsh survived, but 30 other people didn't. 30 people who died because they posed a threat to David Walsh's criminal enterprise. 30 families who never got justice because David Walsh decided their loved ones were expendable. Harrison Webb's closing argument was a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt, to portray David as a dedicated lawyer who'd made some questionable decisions, but wasn't the mastermind criminal the prosecution claimed. But the evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear, the testimony too compelling. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts, murder in the first degree for Richard's death, attempted murder for the attack on me, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, elder abuse, witness tampering. The charges seemed to go on forever. When the foreman read the verdict, David's face remained impassive, but I saw his hands shake slightly as he was led away in handcuffs, saw him glance back at me one last time before the bailiffs took him through the door. That glance contained everything we'd never say to each other again: his anger at being caught, my grief for the son I'd lost, the recognition that our relationship had died long before this trial ever began. But it also contained something else, the acknowledgement that truth had finally won. The convictions didn't end with David. His trial was just the first domino in a line that stretched across the city's most powerful families and deepest into its institutions. Within days of the verdict, arrest warrants were issued for Marcus Peterson, his father for conspiracy and bribery, and 3 other members of wealthy families whose crimes David had helped cover up. The Peterson family's patriarch, Judge William Peterson, was forced to recuse himself from all pending cases while federal investigators examined his rulings in cases involving David's clients. I watched the news coverage from my new apartment, a small but comfortable place with large windows and plenty of natural light. After months in David's basement, I developed an almost pathological need for sunlight and fresh air. Detective Chen had helped me find the apartment, had even helped me move what few belongings I'd been able to recover from David's house. Most of my things had been sold or thrown away during my imprisonment. David had been systematically erasing my existence, preparing for a future where I simply wouldn't be around to need my possessions. But I'd managed to salvage some photographs, my mother's jewelry, and the Bible where I'd hidden Detective Chen's business card, the small act of faith that had ultimately saved my life. The phone rang constantly now, reporters wanting interviews, law enforcement agencies asking about other cases, families of David's victims seeking closure. I answered when I felt strong enough, ignored the calls when I didn't. At 63, I'd earned the right to choose how to spend my energy. One call I always answered came from Tyler Morrison, the son of the family whose witness had died of an apparent overdose. Tyler was around David's age, a public defender who'd been fighting for years to get his mother's case reopened. "Mrs. Walsh," he said during one of our weekly conversations, "I wanted you to know that the DA is reopening my mother's case. They found evidence in David's files that directly implicates him in her death." Tyler's mother, Ellen Martinez, had been the third witness to the Morrison family DUI case 3 years earlier. According to David's files, she'd been killed specifically because her testimony would have been unshakable. She'd been completely sober, had an unobstructed view of the accident, and had no criminal history that could be used to discredit her. "How are you holding up?" I asked Tyler. "Some days are better than others, but knowing what really happened, having proof that my mother didn't that she wasn't using drugs, it helps. It means I can finally grieve properly instead of being angry at her for something she didn't do." These conversations were both the hardest and most important part of my new life. Talking to the families, helping them understand what had happened to their loved ones, sharing the burden of knowing how many lives David had destroyed in service of his wealthy clients. Some of the families were angry at me, as if my survival somehow diminished their losses. Others were grateful that someone had finally exposed the truth. All of them deserved answers, and I did my best to provide them. The investigation continued to spread outward like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Federal agents were now involved, examining David's connections to similar operations in other cities. It turned out that the witness elimination network was much larger than anyone had initially suspected, with lawyers and fixers across the country sharing methods and resources. 6 months after David's conviction, I received a visit from FBI agent Patricia Reeves. She was a serious woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she didn't have much patience for small talk. "Mrs. Walsh, we need your help with something." We believe your son was training other lawyers in his methods, teaching them how to eliminate witnesses and cover up crimes for wealthy clients. She showed me a map of the United States with red pins marking locations where suspicious witness deaths had occurred in high-profile cases involving wealthy defendants. We've identified at least 6 other lawyers who seem to be using David's playbook, but proving the connection is difficult without inside knowledge of how his operation worked. What do you need from me? We need you to help us understand his methods. How he selected victims, how he eliminated them, how he covered up the evidence. You lived through his system, saw it from the inside. Your insights could help us save other potential victims. So I became an unofficial consultant to the FBI's investigation into what they were calling the Walsh Network. It was strange, using my experience as David's victim to help catch other criminals who used his methods. But it also felt like a form of justice, turning David's crimes against me into a weapon against others like him. The work was emotionally exhausting but necessary. Each case file, Agent Reeves showed me, contained photos of real people who died because they'd witnessed crimes committed by the wealthy and powerful. Each death had been carefully staged to look accidental or natural. Each investigation had been subtly discouraged or misdirected. Each family had been left with questions that would never be answered. Until now. One case particularly stood out, the death of Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, in Seattle. Dr. Chen had been treating a young woman who'd been severely beaten by her boyfriend, the son of a prominent tech billionaire. The young woman had been prepared to testify in a domestic violence case when Dr. Chen was found dead in her office, apparently from an allergic reaction to something she'd eaten. The boyfriend's family hired a lawyer named Michael Brennan. Agent Reeves explained, Brennan's methods are identical to your son's: discredit witnesses, create medical emergencies, make problems disappear permanently. Have you arrested Brennan? Not yet. We need more evidence. But Mrs. Walsh, Dr. Chen's death wasn't random. She'd been asking questions about other patients who'd died under suspicious circumstances, other women who'd been prepared to testify against wealthy abusers. Agent Reeves showed me Dr. Chen's research notes, found hidden in her home after her death. The doctor had been tracking a pattern of mysterious deaths among women who'd been prepared to testify in domestic violence cases involving prominent families. She was building a case, I said, studying the notes. Just like you did, but she didn't survive to present it. I stared at the photograph of Dr. Chen, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, someone who'd dedicated her life to helping abuse victims, someone who'd died because she'd gotten too close to the truth about how the wealthy protected their criminal children. What do you want me to do? We want you to help us catch Michael Brennan, and all the others like him. Over the following months, I worked with federal agents to map the network of lawyers and fixers who'd learned from David's example. It was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, a nationwide conspiracy to protect wealthy criminals from the consequences of their actions. But we were closing in on them, one case at a time, one victim at a time. Each conviction sent a message to other lawyers who might be tempted to follow David's path. The age of consequence-free crime for the wealthy was ending. David himself was serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. I'd visited him once since the trial, mainly to see if there was any remorse, any recognition of the damage he'd done. There wasn't. He remained convinced that he'd been providing a valuable service, that the people he'd killed were acceptable casualties in the fight to preserve social order. But during that visit he'd said something that stuck with me. You think you've won, Mom, but you have no idea how deep this goes. You've caught one network, but there are others. Bigger ones. The people I worked for, they're not going to stop just because I got caught. They'll find new ways, new lawyers, new methods. He was probably right. But I'd learned something important during my months in that basement. Something about the power of truth and the importance of speaking it regardless of the consequences. Evil only wins when good people stay silent, and I was done being silent. 2 years after David's conviction, I found myself sitting in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., facing a panel of senators who were investigating corruption in the justice system. The room was packed with reporters, family members of victims, and various officials who'd been caught up in what the media had dubbed the Walsh scandal. Senator Elizabeth Hayes, the committee chairwoman, looked at me over her reading glasses with a mixture of respect and concern. Mrs. Walsh, your testimony has been instrumental in exposing what appears to be a nationwide conspiracy to obstruct justice on behalf of wealthy defendants. Can you tell us how widespread you believe this network actually is? I looked out at the packed hearing room, at the cameras broadcasting my words across the country, and thought about how far I'd come from that basement where David had tried to silence me forever. Senator Hayes, based on what I've learned working with federal investigators over the past 2 years, I believe we've only scratched the surface. David's operation was sophisticated, but it wasn't unique. There are similar networks operating in major cities across the country, all using variations of the same methods he pioneered. I gestured to the stack of case files on the table in front of me, each one representing a suspicious death or disappearance connected to high-profile criminal cases. These files contain evidence of witness elimination schemes in Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, Boston, and at least 6 other cities. The methods vary slightly, but the pattern is always the same. Wealthy defendants hire specialized lawyers who don't just provide legal representation, they provide complete problem elimination. Senator Robert Kane, the conservative member of the committee who'd been skeptical of the investigation, leaned forward. Mrs. Walsh, these are serious allegations. Are you suggesting there's an organized conspiracy among defense attorneys to murder witnesses? I'm not suggesting it, Senator. I'm stating it as fact afforded by evidence gathered by multiple federal agencies over 2 years of investigation. I opened one of the files and pulled out a photograph. This is Jennifer Martinez, age 28, a nurse from Chicago who witnessed a hit-and-run committed by the son of a real estate mogul. She died of an apparent drug overdose 3 days before she was scheduled to testify. The drugs found in her system were the same experimental compounds David was using on me. I showed another photograph. This is Dr. Robert Chen from Los Angeles, an emergency room physician who treated victims of domestic violence committed by members of prominent families. He died in a car accident that forensic investigators now believe was deliberately caused. The photographs continued, each one representing a life cut short because someone had witnessed a crime committed by the wealthy and powerful. The lawyers running these operations don't work in isolation, I continued. They share methods, resources, and sometimes even personnel. David's files contained contact information for dozens of other lawyers across the country, along with detailed records of their techniques for handling inconvenient witnesses. Agent Reeves, sitting at the table beside me, added her perspective. The FBI has identified at least 37 suspicious deaths in the past 10 years that follow the Walsh pattern. These cases span 15 states and involve some of the most prominent families in America. We believe the actual number of victims is much higher. Senator Hayes shuffled through her notes. Agent Reeves, have any other lawyers been arrested in connection with this investigation? Yes, Senator. We've made arrests in 6 cities so far, with more expected. The network is large and well-funded, but it's not invulnerable. Each arrest provides new evidence that leads us to other participants. The hearing continued for 3 days, with testimony from other victims' families, law enforcement officials, and experts on organized crime. The picture that emerged was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The Walsh Network, as it had come to be called, wasn't just a collection of corrupt lawyers. It was a business model that had been perfected over decades and replicated across the country. Wealthy families paid premium fees for lawyers who could guarantee that their criminal children would face no consequences for their actions, no matter how heinous their crimes. The lawyers, in turn, had developed an ecosystem of corrupt officials, compliant medical examiners, intimidated witnesses, and sometimes, when all else failed, hired killers who specialized in making murders look like accidents or suicides. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came on the 3rd day of hearings, when Agent Reeves presented evidence of what they called training seminars. We've uncovered evidence of regular meetings where experienced practitioners like David Walsh would teach their methods to newer lawyers looking to break into this specialty. These seminars covered everything from victim selection to evidence disposal to creating plausible cover stories. She showed the committee photographs from a luxury resort in Montana where one such seminar had taken place. The 2019 seminar at Glacier Peak Resort was attended by 43 lawyers from across the country. The topics covered included advanced witness management, medical method selection, and law enforcement liaison development. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a collection of individual bad actors, it was an organized training program for criminal lawyers, complete with continuing education credits and networking opportunities. Senator Hayes looked appalled. Agent Reeves, are you telling us that there were lawyers attending seminars on how to murder witnesses? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Senator. And they were paying significant fees for the privilege. Registration for the Montana seminar was $50,000 per attendee. I thought about David sitting in his prison cell, probably still convinced that he'd been providing a valuable service to society. In his twisted worldview, these seminars were just professional development, sharing best practices among colleagues who specialized in a particularly challenging area of law. The hearings generated massive media coverage and public outrage. Editorial pages across the country demanded justice system reforms, better protection for witnesses, and federal oversight of legal practices that seemed to prioritize wealth over justice. But the real impact came in the form of new arrests. Within weeks of my testimony, federal agents were executing search warrants in dozens of law offices across the country. The Montana seminar attendee list became a roadmap for investigating corrupt lawyers who'd learned David's methods. 3 months after the hearings, I received a call from Agent Reeves with an update I'd been hoping for. "Mrs. Walsh, we just arrested Michael Brennan in Seattle. The lawyer who killed Dr. Sarah Chen." I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with sadness. Another killer caught but too late to save his victims. "What evidence did you find?" "Everything. Files on dozens of victims, detailed records of payments from wealthy families, even video recordings of some of his seminars where he taught other lawyers his techniques." "How many more arrests do you expect?" "We're still analyzing the evidence, but I'd estimate at least 20 more lawyers across 10 states. The network is finally unraveling." After the call ended, I sat in my apartment looking out at the city where I'd spent my entire life. The same city where David had built his criminal empire, where he'd systematically eliminated anyone who threatened his wealthy clients' interests. But it was also the city where justice was finally being served, where the truth was finally emerging from the shadows where men like David had tried to bury it. I thought about all the victims, the woman who died in the street the night I witnessed the hit and run, Dr. Chen, and the domestic violence victims she'd tried to protect, my own husband Richard, who died trying to save his son from a life of crime. Their deaths hadn't been in vain. Their stories were being told, their killers were being caught, and the system that had failed them was finally being reformed. It wasn't enough to bring them back, but it was something. It was justice, imperfect and delayed, but justice nonetheless. And sometimes when you've been locked in a basement and left for dead by your own son, sometimes justice is enough to build a new life on. 5 years have passed since Detective Chen found me in that basement, and the world looks different now. Not perfect, not completely just, but different in ways that matter. I'm 68 years old, living in a small house outside the city with a garden that blooms in defiance of everything that tried to bury me. The roses are particularly beautiful this year, deep red ones that remind me of the flowers I planted along the fence when I lived next door to David's shame. The Walsh Network trials are finally winding down. In total, 47 lawyers across 18 states have been convicted of crimes ranging from witness tampering to first-degree murder. The federal investigation revealed a systematic corruption of the justice system that reached into every level of law enforcement, from local police departments to federal courts. David himself died in prison last year, stabbed by another inmate whose own family had been destroyed by wealthy criminals who'd escaped justice. I felt neither sadness nor satisfaction when I received the news, just a kind of weary relief that his story was finally over. But the larger story continues. The reforms that came out of the congressional hearings have fundamentally changed how witness protection works in this country. New federal oversight of high-profile cases, mandatory recording of all interactions between prosecutors and defense attorneys, independent medical examination of any witness who dies under suspicious circumstances. It's not foolproof, nothing ever is. But it's better, and sometimes better is all you can ask for. I spend my days now doing something I never expected to do at this stage of my life. I help other victims. The Margaret Walsh Foundation, established with money recovered from David's criminal enterprise, provides legal assistance and protection for witnesses in high-profile cases involving wealthy defendants. We've helped secure convictions in dozens of cases where witnesses might otherwise have been intimidated or eliminated. We've provided safe housing for families threatened by powerful criminals. We've funded investigations into suspicious deaths that local authorities were reluctant to pursue. Yesterday I received a letter from Maria Santos, now a federal prosecutor who specializes in organized crime cases. She wanted to update me on a case in New Orleans where our foundation had helped protect a witness whose testimony led to the conviction of a powerful judge who'd been taking bribes to fix cases. "Your courage in speaking out against your own son started something bigger than any of us imagined," she wrote. "You've helped create a system where truth has a fighting chance against money and power." I keep that letter on my kitchen table next to the photos of Richard and the other victims of David's network. Their faces remind me why this work matters, why speaking truth to power is never optional, no matter how much it costs. Some evenings, when the light is fading and the garden is quiet, I sit on my porch and think about the woman I used to be. The frightened, confused woman who spent months locked in a basement, fighting to hold on to her memories while her own son tried to erase her mind. She seems like a stranger now, that woman. Weak where I've become strong, silent where I've learned to speak, isolated where I've found community with other survivors and fighters. But I remember her with tenderness, because she never gave up. Even when everything seemed hopeless, even when the pills made her thoughts fuzzy and her memories unreliable, even when her own son was treating her like a burden to be disposed of, she kept fighting. She saved the pills. She wrote down what she remembered. She trusted a neighbor and a detective, And that trust saved not just her life but dozens of other lives. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance become the foundation for the largest victories. The phone rings as I'm finishing this thought, and I answer to hear a familiar voice. Mrs. Walsh, this is Detective Chen. I have someone here who wants to thank you. A young woman's voice comes on the line, nervous but determined. Mrs. Walsh, my name is Jessica Morrison. I'm testifying tomorrow against the man who killed my sister. I wanted you to know that your foundation helped make this possible. Without the protection and support you provided, I never would have been brave enough to speak up. You found the courage yourself, Jessica. We just helped create a safe space for you to use it. My sister's name was Amanda Morrison. She was killed 3 years ago because she witnessed a hit-and-run committed by a congressman's son. The local police said there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute, but we knew they were just protecting him. Another family destroyed by the wealthy and powerful. Another victim silenced by a system that valued money over justice. But this time the story was ending differently. With your foundation's help, we were able to get federal investigators involved. They found evidence that the local police had been paid to bury the case, and tomorrow I'm testifying in federal court. The congressman's son is finally going to face justice for what he did to Amanda. After the call ends, I sit in the gathering darkness and think about Amanda Morrison, another name to add to the long list of victims whose stories deserve to be told. But this time her story won't end with her death. This time her killer will face consequences. It's not enough to bring Amanda back, just like it wasn't enough to bring back Richard or Dr. Chen or any of the others. But it's something. It's justice, imperfect and delayed but real. And sometimes when you've crawled out of your own grave and learned to speak truth to power, sometimes imperfect justice is enough to change the world. The last light fades from my garden and I head inside to prepare for tomorrow. There's always another case, another victim, another family that needs help navigating a system that still favors the wealthy and powerful. But the system is changing, one case at a time, one testimony at a time, one act of courage at a time. And I'll keep fighting until the last corrupt lawyer is behind bars, until the last wealthy criminal faces consequences, until the last victim's story is told. They thought they buried me in that basement. They didn't know they were planting a seed. Now watch it grow.